Gabon. Brice Oligui Nguema has begun a 3-day state visit in France at the invitation of President Emmanuel Macron. The two leaders are expected to discuss the greater withdrawal of French forces in Gabon, amongst other things. Since taking office, Macron has been trying to revitalize France's relationship with Africa. Gabon remains one of the countries where France has maintained a strong presence, even after the 2023 coup that brought Oligui Nguema to power. For more on this, we're joined by Paul Melly, who's consulting fellow on the Africa program at Chatham House. Paul, a very good morning to you. Good to chat to you again. So, how should we view this? A routine diplomatic state-to-state visit, or, as I mentioned in the intro, an attempt to reorder, reimagine Africa-France relations? We've already seen a deterioration of that. What could be different about this visit?
Well, I think what from the French point of view, what really matters is a couple of things. One is that wider reimagining and modernizing of France's relationships with Africa, and Gabon provides a very useful case study because it has relatively quite a strong economy, a small population, a lot of resources, oil, minerals, forest products. And so France wants to show how that can be modernized to the benefit of Africa. So one of the big things on the agenda that they seem to have made some progress with an agreement yesterday is how to move Gabon's export of raw manganese, which is mainly produced by a French company, Eramet. The idea is to establish processing facilities. So that will create more jobs and more value in Gabon. And they've reached an agreement yesterday that at the latest will happen by 2031, and it might even happen as early as 2028. So that's part of the modernization agenda. But the other thing is that at a time when France's relationships with the military regimes in the Sahel are so difficult, with Mali, with Niger, with Burkina Faso, with these relationships are very confrontational. Burkina Faso just broke off diplomatic relations with France completely a couple of weeks ago. Macron wants to show that actually it can work with African countries. If they would like to work with France, France is still there as a ready partner. So it's part of that wider message as well. So in that sense, it's a bit like a complement to the Africa Forward Summit that happened recently in Nairobi, where I think it was more than 30 African presidents came to Nairobi for talks with France, again, about economic issues, largely finance and investment, or indeed President Ramaphosa's recent visit to Paris. So it's part of this wider French diplomatic push to say some African countries may not like France, may feel resentment, but actually France is still there as a partner if for those that wish to engage.
But I suppose the question is what type of a partner, because just the genesis of this particular relationship, we mentioned that President Oligui Nguema came through a coup, and that was destabilizing a relationship with one of France's longtime allies. So what role is France looking to play? One of constitutional democratic continuity or strategic continuity? Because there are those who might argue that in supporting or trying to foster better ties with Nguema, they are overlooking the democratic aspect of the relationship.
That's certainly true. It's a really difficult challenge for France, but actually also for other European governments as well. If they become, if they start setting very tight political conditions and saying we will only work closely with countries that have constitutional democratic governments, then sometimes they are accused of interfering in internal affairs. On the other hand, as your question implies, if they don't pay some attention to constitutional issues, respect for human rights, respect for democratic principles, then they can be accused of collaborating with authoritarian rule. And we can see actually this very dramatically illustrated, uh, perhaps less in the case of Gabon, where the old regime, the Bongo regime, was quite corrupt, was a long-standing family regime, more than 50 years in power, and where the election that had taken place had just been rigged at the time to continue the regime in power at the time that Oligui Nguema staged his coup. Um, but more in the case of Guinea, for example, where you also had a sort of a not very effective civilian government deposed by the military, but where the later human rights record has been pretty brutal. And the election that took place in Guinea last December to sort of legitimize the military regime there was clearly not democratic, with most of the opponents shut out of the process altogether. And yet, France's relationships with Guinea are actually quite positive, quite warm, quite strong. So it's a very difficult balancing act, because in the current climate, many African countries, after all, are saying, we want you to respect our sovereignty. It's not up to you to tell us how we should run our internal affairs. But of course, understandably, opponents and human rights activists are saying, surely there should be a role that external partners, France or the EU or Britain or whoever, should also pay some attention to respect to the extent to which human rights are respected.
And just in terms of a post colonial relationship that France is saying it wants to foster, because it says it wants to move away from the paternalistic relationship it's had with Franca Afrique. What would that look like policy wise? Because now, what's entered into the conversation is an acknowledgement of the transatlantic slave trade, but the whole issue of reparatory justice, and that is economic as well. It just goes beyond what has been said before, the traditional sense of reparations. So it means greater equality between the two countries or other countries in Francophone Africa.
Yeah, so it really means showing respect, if you like, for the aspirations and desires of those countries. So in this case, in the case of Gabon, the president said after Oligui Nguema seized power and then later got himself legitimized as a civilian through an election that was not perfect, but was sort of, should we say, semi-democratic, if you like. He expressed the view that he really wanted for this key sector in the manganese production. Gabon's one of the key producers in the world for manganese production. He wanted to get value added in the country. He wanted to stop exporting raw manganese. And the key thing was that France, as the main investor in that sector, should respect that decision, that policy stance, and work with it. So that's part of it. In other words, listening to the aspirations of the governments. Another bit is reducing the French military presence, and Gabon is one of a whole series of countries where France, through a process of discussion, has been reducing or made arrangements to reduce its military presence from several hundred or 1,000 or so troops to just very small training units under agreements that those countries really have have settled. But there is also the historical aspect, and it's not just actually about the slave trade. Often colonial history, as we know, has often been very difficult. And France has actually been quite innovatory here in commissioning or in partnership with African governments a series of historical inquiries into difficult past historical periods. So we've seen this in the case of Cameroon, in the case of Algeria, in the case of Rwanda, for example, these historical commissions who have been looking at really painful episodes in the past. Senegal is another case. And France has collaborated quite strongly with this process. And some of these historical inquiries have actually been initiated by Macron himself rather than the African governments. And so that is a case of saying certain things happened in the past that were very painful, were wrong, were very difficult, and the truth has to be out there. The documents from the colonial period, or even, for example, in the case of Rwanda, of course, only the 1990s, not that long ago, they need to be out there, they need to be public. Another dimension is returning cultural assets looted during the colonial era. So a whole series of treasures have been returned, for example, to Gabon, to Senegal, to Madagascar, to Côte d'Ivoire. So all of this is part of the process. But there's a final bit, which is just the human relations. When a foreign leader visits or receives an African leader, how do they behave? What does that body language, what are the words, what are the television images, the social media images, how do those come across? And that's in some ways the most difficult, because it's about getting tone and showing respect. And there's certainly been times when Macron has been incredibly tactless and arrogant in some remarks, and that has lost him a lot of the goodwill that has been earned through some of the policy shifts that I've just been talking about. So it's a fine, difficult judgment. The alternative is to sort of remain more distant, and one can think that actually most other countries, the UK, the
Okay.
US, have just been less publicly engaging. But France has opted to stand in the middle of the stage, if you like. But while there have been many plus points, but it
Okay.
also requires a really difficult diplomacy.
Paul, I'm afraid we have run out of time, but really appreciate your time and the insights that you've
You're
shared.
very
Paul
welcome.
Melly is a consulting fellow on Africa program at Chatham House. And that's how we come to the end of Rise and Shine. Let's hand over now to Mateko Musito for the journal.
A new hour, a deeper look. The Journal with Mateko Musito. On the Channel Africa app and the SABC Plus app.
It's a minute past 9 a.m. Let's start the journal with the latest in news. Matapelo Mahape is standing by.
SABC News. The African Perspective.
Thank you, Matako. Your top stories this hour. South Africa's IDEC head expected to testify at the Matlanga Commission, and Human Rights Watch calls for investigation of police in India. Good morning. South Africa's Investigative Directorate Against Corruption, IDEC head advocate Andrea Johnson, is expected to take the stand at the Matlanga Commission of Inquiry this morning. Johnson, who was due to testify last Monday, was unable to appear after being rushed to hospital ahead of her scheduled testimony. She has been implicated by several witnesses who allege that she interfered in investigations and defeated the ends of justice